it's merely a passing detail, just as we saw with the 19th century mothers supposedly suffering from lactational insanity, whose abject poverty was portrayed as a contributing but not central factor. Even beyond questions of whether or not BPD is a valid diagnostic category, Langer, in her review of 20 years of Canadian case law, goes on to argue that the real problem women with BPD diagnoses face in the carceral system is not so much the diagnosis itself, but rather the fact that these diagnoses were used to consistently argue for punitive responses to disruptive behavior, such as segregation within the prison complex, frequent moves between institutions, and removal of any other freedoms or privileges. She states they, meaning incarcerated women, are not considered victims of circumstance, but as individuals incapable of adequately managing needs in a way that averts the seemingly foreseeable risks of crime, victimization, poverty, racism, and unemployment. Women with BPD may deteriorate in coercive and institutional settings, resulting in increases in both self-harm and angry behavior, and in consequential perceptions of dangerousness. The diagnosis itself contributes to the erasure of causal socio-structural factors and provides the rationale for both zero-tolerance security approaches and tough love treatment programs. So essentially, BPD may itself be a kind of bullshit sexist diagnosis which pathologizes traumatized women in a way that traumatized men are not pathologized. However, even if it is not a bullshit diagnosis, the way that it is used within the legal system is repressive and essentially amounts to the weaponization of a tenuous and highly contested medical diagnosis to support arguments for further restrictions on the liberty of an individual, most often a woman. And I think we can see how there might be some pretty neat symmetry between the case of BPD and the admittedly much larger scale institutionalization of disruptive women in the Victorian era with medical diagnoses that later turned out to be bullshit, like hysteria, puerperal insanity, ovarian mania, nymphomania, etc. Now, again, I am not a medical professional, nor am I a mental health professional. I make these criticisms from a political and sociological standpoint. And what I'm not saying is that psychiatry is in some way especially evil, more so than any other system of power. What I am saying is that just like every other system of power and arguably every other system of knowledge, it is in fact plagued by the very same isms that we see throughout society: sexism, classism, racism, etc. It is not in fact above the general muck that we operate in as a species. Now, I don't want my meaning to be confused here. I'm not trying to wade into a level of relativism that says, no objective truth is possible because of the biases that are inherent in the human existence. So therefore, let's just not even try. Admittedly, I'm not sure whether we as a species are capable of uncovering like a truly objective truth that's completely free from human bias, because I think that would require us to be able to detach ourselves completely from our subjective experience of the world, which I don't think is possible. But I do think some things are more true than others. And so it's still worthwhile at least trying to be more objective, if that makes sense. So even though psychiatry and arguably all fields of science have elements of human bias weaved throughout their very fabric, I do still think that they are more true, or shall we say evidence-based, than something like, say, astrology, right? Now, please don't come for me, astrology girlies. Like, I also enjoy partaking and I have co-star. I'm just saying it's not exactly like a rock solid theory that your time and location of birth meaningfully shaped your entire personality. But yeah, in essence, what I'm saying is, let's not run away with the idea that because scientific thinking is more evidence-based, it is therefore without any flaws. I think it's important that we can critique all systems of knowledge without that having to amount to a kind of nihilistic relativism. Okay, quick little tangent here before we get on to the last section of the show, because there's something I want to bring up around conversations I have had with people in the past about referencing certain philosophers or thinkers in the show. So I think it was in the episode on community when I talked about John Baudrillard and his theories of hyperreality. And a friend messaged me to essentially say that I shouldn't be referencing Baudrillard because he's a racist and a sexist, right? Now, Foucault may also not be like a morally good person. So French essayist Guy Sorman has alleged that he witnessed Foucault pay for sex with young boys whilst visiting him in Tunisia in the late 1960s, which would obviously be a form of child sexual abuse, given the inability of children to meaningfully consent to sex work. However, this accusation has been contested by others who knew Foucault at the time, and it's just still not very clear exactly what happened. Critics of Foucault have also highlighted that he was very publicly involved in the 1970s with a campaign against the age of consent laws in France, and they've characterized this as a support for the notion that children can meaningfully consent to sex with adults. However, supporters of Foucault have emphasized that this campaign against the age of consent laws was widely supported by a number of public intellectuals, including prominent second-wave feminist Simone de Beauvoir, and characterized Foucault's position not as advocating for sexual relationships between adults and children, but as support for equalizing the age of consent for heterosexual and homosexual relationships, since there was at the time a higher age of consent to engage in gay sex. It may also be revealing that one of the most vocal proponents of this whole, Foucault was a gay paedophile notion is British radical feminist Julie Bindel, who is currently, very much on the outs with the left for her views on transgender rights, which she characterizes as, inherently misogynistic, and has claimed such deranged things as transgender activists want us to start referring to the vagina as a bonus hole. So, all this to say, right, there are some people that might argue that I shouldn't reference or even read Foucault because he may have been a child abuser. But I don't agree with that take, and I don't think that I should have to do what I've just done here, setting out the arguments in favor and against the personal moral standing of a given figure in order to consider his ideas. I have in the past believed that that was necessary, but nowadays I just don't think that we need to only consider the ideas of morally good people. And I think that the Foucault example gives us an idea of the impossibility of actually doing that, right? Ultimately, none of us can know what happened in Tunisia in the 1960s. We can only say, these people have said this and these people have said that. More importantly, though, I think that knowledge is cumulative and referential, meaning that one idea builds on and references another idea. So if you start to try and cut out huge bits of the canon of ideas, it stops really making sense. And Foucault particularly has been unbelievably influential. His ideas have caused entirely new schools of thought to emerge in several disciplines, history being just one of them. He's probably the most important philosopher in the past 100 years, and he's also the most cited academic ever.